My name is Simone Alvarez. I'm 41 years old and I work as a charge nurse in the emergency department at a regional hospital outside Asheville, North Carolina. On the morning of March 4th this year, I stood in my own front yard at 6:40 a.m., still in my scrubs after a 12-hour overnight shift, watching a 32-foot travel trailer sitting exactly where it had sat for the past year, 1 month and 6 days, parked squarely across the shared easement driveway that was, according to a deed recorded in 1996, the only legal vehicle access to my garage. I want to tell you what that trailer actually cost me concretely because vague grievances are not the kind of thing I deal in professionally, and I've stopped dealing in them personally too. 398 days. That's how long Roy Talbert, my neighbor at 14 Fenwick Grove Lane, had kept a camper trailer parked across the easement my house shares with his, blocking the only paved route to my garage, forcing me to park 210 feet down the street and walk home in the dark after night shifts in a neighborhood without sidewalks past his own darkened windows, more nights than I can count. I want to be precise about the morning that actually changed everything, because precision has become the one habit that got me through the worst of that year. On January 22nd, 6 weeks before I stood in that yard doing the math on 398 days, my son Eli, who was 9 years old at the time and has had exercise-induced asthma since he was 5, had an attack severe enough that I called 911 myself, standing in our kitchen with my hands shaking in a way 14 years of ER work had never once caused before. The ambulance took 4 minutes and 12 seconds longer to reach our door than it should have, because the paramedics, following their GPS to our address, initially tried to turn into the blocked easement before realizing they'd have to reroute around the block entirely. I want to describe those 4 minutes and 12 seconds a little because I think numbers alone don't fully capture what they actually felt like from inside my own kitchen. I have coached dozens of frightened parents through exactly this kind of waiting during my career, always from the calm, practiced other side of the counter. I understood, professionally, exactly what those extra minutes meant and didn't mean for Eli's actual outcome. His case was manageable. His oxygen levels stayed within a range I recognized even through my own fear as serious but not yet critical. That professional knowledge didn't make the 4 minutes and 12 seconds pass any faster. I stood in my driveway watching the ambulance's lights finally round the corner from the wrong direction, and felt, for the first time in 14 years of emergency medicine, exactly what it was like to be the frightened parent instead of the calm nurse. I remember standing in our driveway that evening, after Eli had been stabilized and discharged from the very ER I worked in, watching the trailer sitting exactly where it had sat for 336 days by that point, and feeling something in me go entirely, permanently still. Not panic, not even in that specific moment anger, just a quiet, absolute clarity that I had spent nearly a year measuring my own patience against a standard that had never once been reciprocated and that the standard was about to change. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I want you to sit with that number the way I've had to sit with it every day since, because it's the exact reason everything I'm about to tell you finally happened the way it did. Roy Talbert had spent a year telling me and telling our homeowners association and telling anyone who would listen that the trailer parked across our shared easement was temporary, was not a big deal, was, in his words, standing in his own driveway 3 days after Eli's attack with his arms crossed, not something a grown woman should be making this much noise about. What Roy Talbert did not know. Standing there that afternoon was that I had spent the previous 11 months quietly building something in a plain cardboard file box on the top shelf of my hallway closet. 398 days of timestamped photographs, dispatch records, and a piece of paperwork I'd found 4 weeks earlier that proved, in Roy's own words, exactly why that trailer had never been an accident of convenience at all. I want to tell you this story the way it actually unfolded for me, slowly, over nearly 6 years, because I think that's the only honest way to tell it. Nothing about what Roy Talbert did looked dramatic while it was happening. It looked, almost every single time, like an ordinary, forgivable inconvenience between neighbors who genuinely liked each other. A boat for a weekend, a trailer for a month or two. An apology delivered warmly enough that questioning it felt almost unkind. That's exactly what made it so easy for him to keep doing and so hard for a long time for me to name out loud as what it actually was. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've ever been told your own reasonable, documented complaint was somehow the unreasonable thing happening, I think you already know exactly what kind of story this is. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if patient, factual justice is your kind of story, stay with me because this one took 398 days to build, and every single one of them mattered. I want to say, before we go back to the beginning, that I don't think this is really a story about a driveway, whatever the title might suggest. I never once wanted to see Roy Talbert publicly humiliated or run out of the neighborhood for its own sake. What I wanted, for longer than I let myself admit, was simply for a documented right to be treated as a right, not as a favor extended by a likable neighbor, revocable whenever it became inconvenient for him to honor it. That's the story I actually want to tell you tonight. Let me take you back to 2018, the year I bought the house at 12 Fenwick Grove Lane, a small, quiet cul-de-sac of 9 homes built in the mid-1990s outside Asheville, connected to the main road by a single shared paved easement, a private lane technically jointly owned and maintained by the 3 houses whose garages opened onto it. Mine at number 12 and my 2 neighbors at numbers 10 and 14. I was 33, newly divorced, 4 months pregnant with Eli, and the house was the first thing I had ever bought entirely on my own, with a down payment built out of 6 years of overtime shifts in the ER. I want to describe that house a little because I think it matters to understand the setting all of this grew out of. It was a modest, single-story brick ranch, the kind of house that had clearly been well cared for by a previous owner who valued function over flash, a wide, practical driveway, a garage deep enough for both a car and the double stroller I hadn't yet known I'd need. I remember standing in that driveway the day I closed on the house, looking down the shared easement toward the main road, feeling for the first time in my adult life like I had built something entirely my own. I had no idea yet how directly that easement, the thing that had made the house feel so practical and secure, would eventually become the site of the hardest year of my adult life. I want to give you 3 specific memories from those early years on Fenwick Grove Lane because they explain the shape of everything that came later far better than any general description could. The first, my very first week in the house, Roy Talbert at number 14 walked over unannounced while I was still unloading boxes and told me in a friendly enough tone that the shared easement had an understanding among the original 3 homeowners about parking, nothing formal, he said, just neighborly courtesy about not leaving vehicles sitting too long in any one spot. I remember thanking him for the heads up, genuinely grateful at the time for what seemed like a considerate gesture from someone who'd clearly lived there far longer than I had. I didn't yet understand that understanding, in Roy's vocabulary, would eventually mean whatever was convenient for Roy. I remember, specifically, how confident he seemed describing that unwritten arrangement, as though it were simply common knowledge rather than something he was, in that exact moment, quietly defining for the first time to a newcomer with no way of checking it against anything else. I didn't think to ask that first week whether the actual recorded easement said anything different. I had just closed on a house, alone, 4 months pregnant, and Roy's confident, easy authority felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of established neighbor guidance I was grateful to have. The second, about a year later, pregnant and exhausted, I mentioned to my neighbor at number 10, a retired school teacher named Willa Fenton who'd lived on the lane since the houses were built, that I appreciated how easygoing everyone seemed about sharing the driveway. She'd laughed not unkindly and said, "Easygoing's one word for it. Roy's just never once had anyone push back on him, so it's never had to become a fight." I didn't think much of that comment at the time. I filed it away the way you file away a stranger's offhand remark, sad but not yet relevant to you. I remember, specifically, the way Willa said it, not bitterly, but with the particular resignation of someone who'd simply stopped expecting the dynamic to change, the way you stop expecting weather to be different than the forecast says it'll be. She'd lived beside Roy for over 20 years by that point, long enough to have watched whatever version of this pattern had played out with the Hendricks before me, and long enough, I think, to have made her own peace with simply staying out of its way whenever it resurfaced. I didn't fully understand that afternoon that I was hearing a warning dressed up as a passing observation. The third, the week Eli was born in October of 2018, Roy and his wife Diane left a casserole on my porch with a note that read, "Welcome to the world, little one. Fenwick Grove looks out for its own." I remember being genuinely moved by that, standing in my kitchen holding a 2-day-old baby, believing in that exhausted, grateful haze new parents live in, that I had landed somewhere that would actually take care of us. I would think about that note very differently 6 years later, standing in my own front yard doing math on a year I never should have had to fight for. I still have that note actually tucked into a baby book I never quite finished filling out, and I found myself pulling it out again during that final February, turning it over in my hands at my kitchen table, reading the same 6 words that had once felt like a promise. Fenwick Grove looks out for its own. I remember thinking, sitting there, how strange it was that the sentiment hadn't technically been false. Exactly, Roy had, in his own way, been looking out for his own interests on that street for 6 years running. I had simply spent most of that time assuming, without ever examining the assumption closely, that its own was meant to include me. That's the shape of Fenwick Grove Lane going into everything that followed. A shared easement built on an informal understanding that had never once in nearly 30 years been tested by anyone willing to say no to Roy Talbert. I would turn out to be the first. There's a fourth memory worth including too, because it explains something about why I let this pattern run as long as it did. I grew up the daughter of a father who worked as a building inspector for 30 years, a man who believed, almost as a matter of principle, that most conflicts between neighbors could be avoided entirely if people were simply willing to be a little more patient with each other than the situation strictly required. I absorbed that belief early and completely, and it served me well in most of my life. As a nurse, patience is very nearly the entire job. It took me until my 40s, standing in my own yard doing math on 398 days, to understand that patience, offered indefinitely and without limit, isn't a virtue at all once the other person has learned exactly how far it can be stretched. I want to add, honestly, that I don't think my father would have seen it any differently than I eventually came to. His entire career was built on the specific conviction that patience and vigilance weren't opposites, that a good inspector could be endlessly courteous with a homeowner while still, without fail, writing down exactly what the code actually required. I think I spent much of my 30s believing that courtesy and documentation were somehow at odds with each other, that keeping careful records made me less kind rather than simply more honest. It took me the entire length of that final year to finally understand that my father had never once seen it that way himself. By the summer of 2019, Eli was 8 months old and I was back at the hospital full-time, working a rotation of overnight shifts that left me arriving home most mornings between 7:00 and 7:30 a.m., exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way only 12 hours in an ER can produce. That June, Roy parked a 22-foot fishing boat across the easement for what he told me apologetically would be just the weekend, while he waited on a trailer hitch repair. I remember that first morning I came home to find the boat there, still in scrubs, Eli's car seat in the back, calculating in my head how tight the remaining gap actually was before attempting to thread my sedan through it. I managed it, that first time, with maybe 8 inches to spare on either side, my hands tight on the wheel the way they never were even during the most chaotic ER shifts. I remember thinking, pulling into my own garage that morning, that this was simply what living beside a considerate but occasionally forgetful neighbor looked like, an inconvenience, not a pattern, because I had no reason yet to believe it would become one. The weekend became 11 days. When I mentioned it to him gently on day 9, standing in my driveway still in scrubs, he said, "Simone, come on, it's a boat, not a wall. You can still get around it if you're careful." I want to be honest that at the time, I could technically maneuver my sedan around the edge of the boat with careful, patient inches to spare. My rationalization that summer was straightforward. Roy had been kind to us when Eli was born, the inconvenience was temporary and survivable, and raising a formal complaint over 11 days of tight parking felt, to a new mother running on 4 hours of sleep, like more effort than it was worth. There's a smaller incident from that same summer worth including, because it's the first time I remember the pattern extending beyond the easement itself. That August, I noticed Roy had begun leaving his own household trash and recycling bins along the shared easement on collection days, positioned in a way that narrowed the already tight passage even further, sometimes for a full extra day after pickup while he was traveling. When I mentioned it lightly, he laughed and said, "Oh, that's nothing, Simone, everybody does that from time to time, it's not like the boat." I remember noting, even then, how each small liberty he took seemed to get measured only against the largest one he'd already taken, rather than against what the actual easement document allowed. It became, without either of us naming it, the informal scale by which every future inconvenience would eventually be judged. Not is this acceptable, but is this worse than the boat? The following spring, in 2020, the boat reappeared for what Roy described as just a quick tune-up before the season, parked in the same spot for 6 days this time. When I asked about the shared easement understanding he described my first week on the lane, he laughed easily and said, "That understanding's always been more of a guideline than a rule, Simone. Nobody's ever actually needed it enforced strictly. We're all reasonable people here." I remember that phrase specifically, a guideline, not a rule, because it would resurface in one form or another for the next 4 years every single time the boat and later the trailer sat somewhere it technically shouldn't have. There's a second incident from that same year I want to include, small on its own but part of the widening pattern. That October, Roy replaced his own mailbox post with a taller, decorative one that extended nearly 2 feet into the shared easement's edge, narrowing the usable width for any vehicle passing close to his side. When I mentioned it, he seemed genuinely surprised anyone would notice and said, "That's barely anything, Simone, it's a mailbox post, not a fence." I didn't push it further at the time. 2 feet of decorative post felt by itself like an absurd thing to formally complain about. I understand now that it was one more small, individually defensible inch, added to a widening collection of inches that, taken together, had begun quietly reshaping what the recorded easement actually guaranteed in practice, regardless of what it still guaranteed on paper. There's a third incident from that same period worth including, because it shows the pattern extending into shared financial obligations as well. In 2020, the 3 easement-sharing households split the cost of repaving a cracked section of the shared lane, and $1,800 project divided evenly at $600 per household under the terms of the original 1996 agreement. Roy, who'd organized the contractor himself, later told Willa and me that his share had come in a little higher than expected due to some extra grading work near his end, and asked us each to cover an additional $140 to balance it out. Willa paid without question. I paid too at the time, though I remember asking mildly whether he had an itemized invoice showing the extra grading work. He said he'd dig it up and send it over, and never did. I let it go, the way I let most things go that year, filing the unanswered request away in the same mental drawer as everything else I hadn't yet learned to call a pattern. I don't want you to think those early years were only this. Willa Fenton, at number 10, became something close to a real friend during that stretch, especially after her husband passed in 2020 and I started bringing Eli by for short visits most weekends, watching him toddle around her garden while she told me stories about the lane's early years. She never said much directly about Roy, but she'd occasionally mention, almost offhandedly, small things, a parking dispute from years before I'd moved in, a complaint that had quietly gone nowhere. I started paying closer attention to those small observations than I let on. I remember one particular afternoon that fall, sitting on Willa's back porch while Eli napped in his stroller nearby, when she said, apropos of nothing, "You know, the couple who lived in your house before you, the Hendricks, they had the same trouble with Roy and that boat on and off for years. They just never had a reason strong enough to push back on it before they moved." I asked her what had finally made them leave. She thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't think anything dramatic. I think they just got tired in a way that doesn't have a single moment attached to it. That's usually how it goes with Roy. Nobody ever has one big fight with him. They just quietly run out of patience 1 week at a time until moving feels easier than staying." I didn't understand, sitting there that afternoon, how directly she was describing a road I would eventually walk myself in a different direction, refusing to let it end the same way. There was also my co-worker Marisol Ortiz, a fellow ER nurse and close friend since nursing school, who became the person I called, more nights than either of us could count, on the drive home from a hard shift. She was the one who first suggested, that same year, that I start photographing the easement whenever it was blocked, just so you have a record, not because I think it'll ever actually matter. I started keeping a folder of dated photos on my phone that fall, more out of habit than any real expectation I'd ever need it for anything beyond my own private irritation. By 2021, the pattern had settled into something close to routine, the boat appearing for a week or two, several times a year, always with an apology attached, always framed as temporary. That October, curious after a particularly long 10-day stretch, I drove to the County Register of Deeds and requested the original 1996 easement document for Fenwick Grove Lane. I want to describe what I found there because it mattered enormously later. I remember the specific feeling of sitting at a long table in the records office, waiting for a clerk to pull the original recorded document from a drawer of microfiche that clearly hadn't been consulted in years, and feeling almost foolish for having come at all, as though I were investigating a crime that hadn't technically happened yet. The document itself, when it finally arrived, was plainer than I expected. 2 pages, a simple legal description, and a single paragraph that would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. The easement was recorded plainly. A 20-foot-wide paved right-of-way jointly owned by numbers 10, 12, and 14, with explicit language guaranteeing unobstructed vehicular access at all times for all 3 properties. There was no understanding. There was no guideline. There was a recorded legal document, older than my ownership of the house, stating in exact terms what Roy had spent 3 years quietly redefining in his own favor. I made 2 copies that same afternoon, one for my own records and one, on impulse, that I mailed to myself unopened by certified mail, a habit I'd read about once in an entirely unrelated context and filed away without ever expecting to actually use it. I didn't confront him with it that year. I want to be honest about why. I still believed at that point that the relationship mattered more than the paperwork, that raising a legal document against a neighbor who'd brought us a casserole when Eli was born would permanently sour something I valued. I filed a copy of the deed in the same folder where I'd been keeping Marisol's suggested photographs, and told myself I was simply being prepared, not preparing for anything in particular. There's a second incident from that same year worth including, because it shows the pattern extending into permanent structures rather than just temporary vehicles. That December, Roy built a low decorative retaining wall along his side of the easement, framed as a simple landscaping improvement that in practice narrowed the paved right-of-way by an additional 18 inches at its widest point. When I raised it with him mildly, he said, "It's decorative stone, Simone, it's barely encroaching at all, and it looks a lot nicer than bare dirt." I remember measuring it myself that same week with a tape measure from my own garage, confirming the 18 inches, and deciding once again that formally contesting a retaining wall over a year and a half after the fact felt like more conflict than the inches themselves justified. I understand now that I was, once again, measuring each new liberty only against the largest one that had come before it, rather than against the 20 feet the recorded easement had always actually guaranteed. That's the machinery of it, and I want to name it clearly right here because it's the single most important sentence in this entire story. Every individual incident taken alone looked like a small, forgivable inconvenience, a boat for a weekend, a trailer for a tune-up, a favor between neighbors who genuinely liked each other. It's only when you lay 5 years of those incidents end to end, against a legal document that had guaranteed something entirely different the whole time, that the actual shape of it becomes impossible to miss. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment because I think it describes something larger than just Roy Talbert. A recorded right, unenforced patiently enough for long enough, doesn't stay a right in practice, even when it remains one on paper. It slowly becomes something closer to courtesy, one that the person benefiting from your patience begins eventually to treat as theirs to grant or withhold, rather than yours to simply exercise. I understood that intellectually, sitting in the county records office reading a plainly worded 1996 deed. I don't think I fully understood it emotionally until years later, watching a 32-foot trailer sit in that exact spot for the better part of 13 months. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever let a documented right quietly get redefined as a favor you should be grateful for, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't hit subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happened next is the year that actually gives this story its title. I want to pause here briefly before moving into that final year to say something about what it actually feels like to live inside a slow-building pattern like this one for years before you have the language or the proof to name it clearly. It doesn't feel like a single, dramatic injustice. It feels like a low, cumulative fatigue that seeps into how you talk about your own neighborhood at work, how you answer when a coworker asks whether you like where you live, how you start, without quite noticing, to build your own quiet explanations for things that never should have needed explaining at all. I spent years telling people, including myself, that Roy was simply a character, that the boat and the trash cans and the mailbox post were just the ordinary friction of small-town neighborliness. Some of that was even true, but underneath it, quietly, a pattern was building anyway, whether I was ready to call it one or not. I also want to name, honestly, that not everyone on Fenwick Grove Lane experienced Roy the way I did. Two of the households on the far side of the cul-de-sac, not sharing our easement, described him warmly, almost without exception, whenever his name came up: the neighbor who'd helped jump a dead battery, the one who organized the summer cookout. I don't doubt that version of him was also real. I think that's often how these patterns survive as long as they do. The person causing the harm is genuinely, uncomplicatedly kind to everyone standing just outside its reach, which makes it that much harder for the people standing directly inside it to be believed, or sometimes even to believe themselves. On February 16th, 3 years after I'd pulled that deed from the county archive and quietly filed it away, Roy Talbert backed a newly purchased 32-foot travel trailer into the exact center of the shared easement and left it there. When I asked him that first week how long he expected to need the space, he told me, "Just until we get the driveway extension poured at our place, shouldn't be more than a month or two." I want you to remember that date, February 16th, because it is the first day of the 398 I mentioned earlier, and because a month or two would eventually stretch into more than 13 times that length. I remember standing in my own driveway that first evening, looking at the trailer's full length blocking what had 3 years earlier been confirmed to me in writing as a legally guaranteed right-of-way, and feeling a specific, quiet resolve settle into me that hadn't been there for the boat, or the trash cans, or any of the smaller inconveniences of the previous 5 years. I didn't say anything different to Roy that first week than I would have said in any previous year. But something in me had already shifted, even if I couldn't have named it clearly yet, from a person absorbing an inconvenience to a person beginning deliberately to keep score. By March, 3 weeks in, the month or two Roy had promised had already, on its face, become mathematically improbable. No permit application for the driveway extension had been filed with the county. A fact I confirmed myself with a single phone call to the permits office out of simple curiosity rather than any particular suspicion yet. I remember hanging up that call and feeling the first real flicker of something sharper than the mild irritation I'd carried through 5 years of boats and mailbox posts. I didn't act on that flicker yet. I simply noted it, the way I'd noted everything else, and kept photographing. I began photographing the trailer every single day that spring, timestamped, the way Marisol had suggested years earlier, though neither of us could have guessed how literally I would eventually need to count. I want to walk you through the months of that year in enough detail that you understand exactly what blocked for a year actually meant in practice, because I think the specifics matter more than the general shape. I want to describe specifically what the daily reality of that year actually looked like, beyond the formal complaints and board letters. Most mornings after a night shift, I parked 210 feet down the street, in a spot barely wide enough for my sedan between two neighbors' mailboxes, and walked home in whatever weather the season offered: rain, occasional ice, the particular gray pre-dawn light of an Asheville winter. Eli, once he was old enough to notice the pattern, started asking some mornings whether we could just squeeze by the trailer instead. A request I said no to more often than yes, unwilling to risk either the car's mirrors or, more importantly, teaching him that squeezing through a gap someone else created was an acceptable substitute for the access we were actually owed. By April, 6 weeks in, I raised the issue formally with the HOA board for the first time, submitting a written complaint along with photographs and a copy of the 1996 easement document. The board president that year was a man named Wade Higgins, Roy's longtime golf partner, who responded within a week with a letter stating that the board had reviewed the matter and determined that temporary equipment storage during a home improvement project fell within acceptable use of the shared easement, provided it didn't exceed a reasonable timeframe, a phrase the HOA's own bylaws left entirely undefined. I remember reading that letter twice, standing at my own kitchen counter, checking and rechecking the actual bylaws myself to confirm I hadn't simply missed some clause that made Wade's interpretation legitimate. I hadn't. The bylaws, as written, said nothing at all about equipment storage timelines, leaving the entire question to what Wade himself described in his letter as board discretion that I was beginning to understand would always resolve in whichever direction kept Wade's golf partner comfortable. By June, 4 months in, I filed a second complaint, noting that no driveway extension work had actually begun at Roy's property despite the stated justification. Wade's response, delivered this time by phone rather than in writing, was warm and dismissive in equal measure. "Simone, I hear you, but you've got to understand Roy's dealing with a lot right now, contractor delays, permit issues, that sort of thing. I really don't think it's fair to come down hard on a neighbor going through a rough patch. You're still able to get in and out, aren't you?" I remember that call clearly, standing in the hospital parking lot on a break between patients, phone pressed to my ear, watching Wade's tone shift, sentence by sentence, from something that sounded like consideration into something closer to gentle reprimand, as though I were the one who needed managing, rather than the situation itself. I asked him directly, that same call, what specific timeframe the board considered reasonable under the bylaws. He laughed a little uncomfortably. "There's no exact number, Simone, it's more of a judgment call based on the circumstances." I understood, hanging up that call, that judgment call meant in practice whatever judgment Wade happened to be exercising on his golf partner's behalf that particular month. I want to name something explicitly here because it's worth saying plainly. I was still able to get in and out, technically, by parking down the street and walking, or by threading my sedan through a gap along the trailer's edge that grew narrower with every month it sat there. Wade's question wasn't really asking whether I had access. It was asking whether my inconvenience had yet crossed some invisible threshold he'd get to define, on Roy's behalf, whenever it suited him. By September, 7 months in, the near miss with Eli's ambulance happened. Not the January incident I mentioned in the cold open, but an earlier one, smaller, that I hadn't yet let myself treat as a warning. A pizza delivery driver, following his GPS, had to reverse nearly the full length of the cul-de-sac to find an alternate route after the trailer blocked his direct path to my door. It was a minor, almost comic inconvenience at the time. I photographed it anyway, the way I'd photographed everything else, filing it without quite knowing yet how directly it foreshadowed what would happen 4 months later with an ambulance instead of a pizza driver. I want to describe the months of October through January a little more fully, because they were, in a strange way, the quietest stretch of the entire year, and I think that quiet mattered. I stopped raising formal complaints for a while during that stretch, partly out of sheer exhaustion, partly because Wade's responses had become so predictable that drafting a new one felt like writing the same letter to myself over and over. I kept photographing. I kept parking down the street on the nights the gap along the trailer's edge grew too narrow to risk my sedan's mirrors. I told myself more than once during those months that I was simply waiting Roy out, the way I'd waited out the boat for 5 years running, without letting myself fully register how different this particular wait actually was. The moment that actually completed my understanding of all of this arrived on February 9th of the following year, 6 weeks before I stood in my yard counting to 398, and 1 week before Eli's asthma attack. I was walking Eli to the bus stop that morning when I passed close enough to Roy's open garage to hear him on a call, his voice carrying the way voices do in a quiet cul-de-sac at 7:15 in the morning. I want to describe what I heard carefully because it's the moment everything else in this story actually turned on. "Right," the attorney said, "as long as it's continuous and open for the full statutory period, we've got a real argument for prescriptive rights over that strip. I just need it parked exactly where it is until the anniversary date, no gaps, or the clock resets and we start over." I stopped walking. Eli tugged my hand, asking why we'd paused, and I told him, my voice steadier than I felt, that I'd just remembered something at home. I walked him the rest of the way to the bus stop in a kind of careful, deliberate calm, and then I drove straight to the Buncombe County Law Library on my day off and spent 4 hours learning exactly what prescriptive easement meant. I want to describe those 4 hours a little, because I don't think I've ever moved through information that fast in my life, including during trauma codes at work. I pulled statute after statute, cross-referencing case law I barely understood on my first pass, calling Tabitha's office twice that same afternoon just to confirm I was reading the right sections correctly before I'd even become her client. By the time I left the library that evening, I had a rough working understanding of exactly what Roy needed, exactly how long he needed it, and exactly how close he had already come to getting it. I want to explain it plainly, the way I eventually explained it to a lawyer myself, because I think it matters. Under North Carolina law, if a person maintains open, continuous, and uninterrupted use of another's land, including blocking someone else's legal right-of-way, for a specific statutory period, they can, under certain conditions, acquire a legal claim that effectively extinguishes the original owner's rights over that portion of land. Roy Talbert had not been keeping a trailer parked across my driveway out of laziness or contractor delays or bad luck with permits. He had been deliberately, continuously blocking a 20-foot right-of-way for over a year, on the advice of an attorney, specifically to build a legal claim that would have permanently altered who actually controlled access to my own garage. I remember sitting at a long table in that law library, surrounded by statute books I hadn't opened since a single undergraduate elective 15 years earlier, feeling something shift in me with each new page, not the shock I might have expected, but something closer to a strange, grim clarity, the sense of watching a diagnosis finally confirm a symptom I'd been quietly tracking for months without a name for it. By the time I left that library, I understood not just what Roy had been doing, but precisely how close he'd already come to succeeding, and precisely how little time I actually had left to stop it. I sat with that understanding for a long time in my car outside the law library before driving home. Not the betrayal itself. Some quiet part of me had already suspected by that point that 11 months of excuses didn't add up to bad luck. It was the specific, deliberate calculation of it that stayed with me. A year of casseroles and warm apologies in just a month or two, running the entire time alongside an actual legal strategy, timed to a specific anniversary date, designed to permanently take something from me while making sure I never once had reason to suspect it was anything other than an inconvenient accident. I called Marisol that same evening, sitting in my parked car outside my own house because I needed a few minutes before walking in and pretending the day had been ordinary. I told her everything: the overheard call, the 4 hours in the law library, 11 months of photographs suddenly reorganizing themselves in my head into something with an actual shape and an actual deadline. I remember how strange my own voice sounded to me during that call, steady in a way that didn't match what I actually felt underneath it. The same voice I use giving a report at a shift change, flat and factual regardless of how serious the underlying situation actually is. Marisol picked up on that immediately, the way only someone who's worked beside you through 100 hard shifts can. "You're doing the calm voice thing," she said partway through my explanation. "You can stop doing the calm voice thing with me." I laughed, despite everything, and let my voice actually crack for the first time that day, admitting finally how frightened I'd actually been standing outside that garage, listening to a stranger's future plans for my own driveway discussed like an ordinary Tuesday errand. Marisol was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said something I've turned over many times since. "Simone, you've spent your whole career being the person who stays calm when everyone else is panicking, who documents everything because that's just how your brain works under pressure. I think some part of you already knew this wasn't just Roy being difficult. I think the real question now isn't whether it's true, it's what you're finally going to do now that you know exactly what the deadline is." That sentence landed harder than almost anything else anyone said to me that whole year, because she was right, and I think I'd known, on some level, for longer than I'd let myself admit. I had been photographing that trailer daily for nearly a year by then, quietly, out of a habit I'd told myself was simply cautious record-keeping. Some part of me had always understood that a person doesn't keep that kind of meticulous, dated record about their own driveway unless some part of them is already preparing for the day they'll finally need it. I want to walk through the weeks that followed in some detail because I think the emotional weight of this story lives less in the confrontation itself than in the long, quiet work of deciding what to actually do with what I now knew. I met with a real estate attorney the following week, a careful, unhurried woman named Tabitha Reyes, who specialized in easement and boundary disputes and who reviewed my entire folder, 300 and some photographs, the recorded 1996 easement, my written complaints to the HOA and Wade's dismissive responses. And now, at the front, a dated note describing exactly what I'd overheard outside Roy's garage. I remember the first of my meetings with Tabitha especially clearly because it was the first time I'd said the whole story out loud, start to finish, to someone with no personal stake in how it landed. She listened without interrupting for nearly 40 minutes, taking careful notes, and when I finished she set her pen down and asked me something I hadn't expected. How long have you known, on some level, that this wasn't really about a home improvement project? I sat with that question longer than I expected to before answering. Honestly, probably since the second year when the boat came back for the trailer hitch a second time. I think I've known for 4 years, I just hadn't let myself call it what it actually was. She nodded, unsurprised, the way I imagined she'd nodded at 100 other clients who'd said some version of the same thing. That's more common than you'd think, she said. Recognizing a pattern and being ready to act on it are two very different moments, and there's nothing wrong with needing the distance between them. Tabitha went quiet for a long moment, flipping through page after page before finally looking up at me. "Simone," she said, "I want to be very direct with you because I think this is more serious than you may have let yourself feel it was. What you're describing is a textbook attempt at establishing a prescriptive easement through deliberate, continuous obstruction. If he'd succeeded, if he'd kept that trailer in place, uncontested, for the full statutory period without you formally objecting in a way that reset the clock, he could have gone to court with a real argument that he'd acquired rights over your right-of-way. Your written HOA complaints, dated and time-stamped the way you've kept them, are exactly what would have prevented that, whether you fully understood that's what you were doing or not." I remember asking her, almost sheepishly, whether it mattered that Roy had never once, in writing, admitted what he was actually doing, that every single complaint I'd raised for a year had been met with warm, plausible-sounding explanations about contractor delays and permit issues. Tabitha shook her head. "Intent is easier to prove with a pattern than with a single incident, not harder. A year of shifting excuses, none of which were ever true, combined with an overheard conversation describing a specific legal strategy and a specific anniversary deadline, that's not a coincidence, Simone. That's a plan, and now it's a documented one." I also want to describe, honestly, the particular texture of the weeks that followed that first meeting with Tabitha, because I don't think deciding to confront my neighbor fully captures what it actually felt like to live inside. There were mornings I woke up entirely certain. The plan settled and calm in my chest the way a completed patient handoff feels, every detail checked, every piece of information passed along cleanly, nothing left to second guess. And there were other mornings, usually after a hard overnight shift, when the whole plan felt suddenly disproportionate, reckless even, like I was preparing to detonate 6 years of neighborly goodwill over something that might, in some alternate version of events, have quietly resolved itself if I'd simply waited a little longer, the way I'd waited already for nearly a year. I remember one specific morning in particular, coming home after a brutal overnight shift that had included 2 codes back-to-back, standing in my kitchen at 8:00 a.m. staring at the cease and desist draft Tabitha had emailed me overnight, and feeling for the first time since finding the deed, genuinely unsure whether I had the strength left, that particular week, to actually go through with any of it. I called in sick to a family gathering that weekend rather than face explaining any of it out loud to relatives who'd only ever heard the lighter, boat-related version of the story. I'm not proud of that particular Sunday. I include it here because I think it's honest, and because I think anyone who's ever built up the resolve to finally act on something long overdue deserves to hear that the resolve doesn't always arrive in a single, permanent piece. Sometimes it comes and goes for weeks before it finally holds. Marisol was patient with both versions of me that whole stretch, in a way I don't think I've ever properly thanked her for. She didn't try to talk me out of the doubt on the hard mornings, and she didn't try to inflate my confidence on the easy ones. She just kept asking the same steady question again and again whenever I spiraled. What does the folder actually say, Simone? Not what you're afraid it means. What does it actually say? And every single time going back to the photographs themselves, dated, time-stamped, impossible to argue with on their own plain terms, settled me faster than any reassurance she could have offered instead. I want to be honest about the fear underneath all of this because I think it's the real emotional center of the whole story more than any easement document or photograph. It wasn't primarily fear of losing the driveway, though that mattered enormously. It was a smaller, more specific fear. When I finally let myself say out loud to Marisol one night that February, sitting in my kitchen with 2 mugs of tea going cold between us, if I stop being the easygoing neighbor who quietly works around whatever inconvenience gets put in front of her, what happens to Eli and me on the street? Who are we to these people, if not the family that doesn't make a fuss? I thought about the note Roy and Diane had left on my porch the week Eli was born. Fenwick Grove looks out for its own, and how completely I had believed it, standing in my kitchen holding a 2-day-old baby, exhausted and grateful and entirely unsuspecting. I thought about 6 years of photographing, documenting, quietly absorbing one excuse after another, and understood sitting there that I had built an entire relationship with this street around the assumption that patience and goodwill would eventually be met with the same. Roy hadn't invented that assumption in me. He had simply found it, recognized exactly how long it would take me to abandon it, and built a year-long legal strategy around the specific, calculated bet that I never would. There was a specific evening that February, about 10 days before I finally acted, when I sat on the edge of Eli's bed after he'd fallen asleep, watching him breathe in the particular stillness only a sleeping child has, and I thought about what it would actually mean long-term. To let this resolve the way I'd let 5 years of smaller versions of it resolve, quietly, without ever making Roy face the actual shape of what he'd done, hoping the trailer would simply move on its own eventually and the whole uncomfortable year would fade from memory. I decided, sitting there in the dark, that I did not want Eli to grow up on a street where the lesson, learned early and often, was that the reasonable, patient person is always the one expected to keep absorbing whatever gets put in front of her. I also spent part of that week thinking, more than I expected to, about my own father, the building inspector, and the particular brand of patience he'd taught me almost by osmosis over an entire childhood. I don't believe in signs particularly, and I don't think this story needs one to land. But I found myself more than once that week, standing in my own driveway after a shift, looking at the exact spot where the boat had first appeared 6 years earlier, and thinking about a specific thing my father used to say about his own work, that a good inspector isn't the person who assumes the worst about every building. It's the person who knows exactly which small, deferred problems left unaddressed long enough eventually become the kind that can't be fixed at all. I understood standing there that I had been treating this driveway the way an inexperienced inspector treats a small crack in a foundation, noting it, filing it, assuming it would either resolve on its own or stay small enough to ignore indefinitely. It had done neither. I called my father that same week, something I don't do often enough, mostly just to hear his voice rather than to ask his advice specifically. When I finally told him a shortened version of what had been happening, he was quiet for a moment before saying, in the same measured tone he'd used to talk me through countless childhood scrapes, "You know, in my whole career, I never once met a homeowner who regretted calling the inspector too early. Every single regret I ever heard was about waiting too long, hoping the crack would stay small on its own." I told him I thought I finally understood what he meant, in a way I hadn't quite understood it as a child listening to him say it at the dinner table. He laughed gently and said he was glad it only took me until 41 to catch up. I want to walk through the final 2 weeks in some detail because I think they matter. Tabitha helped me draft 2 documents. A formal cease and desist letter to Roy, citing the recorded easement and putting him on explicit legal notice that any prescriptive claim was being formally contested as of that date, and a shorter, plainer summary, 4 pages instead of the full 3-inch thick folder, organized specifically to be read aloud. clearly and without legal jargon at the HOA's upcoming annual meeting, where, I'd learned from Willa, a new slate of board candidates was running specifically on a platform of actually enforcing the bylaws for once. A phrase that suggested I wasn't the only person on Fenwick Grove Lane who'd grown tired of Wade Higgins's particular brand of reasonableness. I remember the specific afternoon Tabitha and I finalized the cease and desist letter, sitting in her office with the recorded easement spread flat between us, her walking me through each clause slowly enough that I understood not just what the letter said but exactly why each sentence had been worded the way it had. "This isn't really written for Roy," she told me, tapping the final paragraph. "He already knows everything in here. This is written for a judge if it ever comes to that, and for the HOA board right now. Every word needs to hold up to someone reading it cold with no context months from now." I appreciated that clarity more than I expected to, the specific relief of watching someone else apply the same exacting standard to language that I applied every working day to a patient's chart. I decided one more thing that final week, sitting with Marisol at my kitchen table 2 nights before the meeting. I would not confront Roy privately in the quiet driveway conversation he'd clearly grown comfortable managing for a year. I would wait for the annual meeting, the one setting on Fenwick Grove Lane where every homeowner, including the new board candidates, would be gathered in one room, unable to quietly explain away a pattern the way Wade had explained it away, one phone call at a time for 11 months running. The Fenwick Grove annual HOA meeting was held that year in the clubhouse of a neighboring subdivision that rented out its community room. 26 of Fenwick Grove's 31 households represented, more than I'd ever seen at a single meeting in 6 years living there. Roy sat near the front, the way he always did, confident in a room he'd spent years treating as an extension of his own driveway. I'd requested 5 minutes under new business, and Wade, clearly uneasy but unable to find a graceful way to deny it in front of that large a crowd, gave it to me. I stood up with a folder, not the full 398 photographs, just a 12-page summary Tabitha had helped me build, organized the way I'd learned to organize a patient chart, clearly, chronologically, with nothing left for anyone to reasonably dispute. I'd printed 26 copies of that summary the night before, one for every household represented, a decision Tabitha had specifically recommended. "Don't just tell them," she'd said. "Give them something to hold, something they can reread later when the room's emotions have settled, and they need to remember it was never actually complicated." I handed the stack to Ophelia's predecessor at the sign-in table before the meeting started, and watched over the next 20 minutes as they made their way slowly around the room, passed hand to hand, several people pausing to actually read the first page before the meeting had even formally begun. I want to describe the room in that moment because I think the physical details matter. It was early evening, the community room's fluorescent lights a little too bright, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows that someone had clearly set up in a hurry. I could see Diane sitting 2 rows back from Roy, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I could see 3 of the new board candidates near the back, notebooks out, the way people sit when they suspect they're about to hear something worth writing down. I remember taking a slow breath before I started, the same breath I take before delivering difficult news to a patient's family, the one that buys just enough stillness to make sure the first sentence comes out steady. "I want to walk everyone through the last year," I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd rehearsed twice alone in my car that week. "Not because I think most of you don't already have some sense of it, because I don't think most of you have actually seen it laid out end to end the way I have." I read through the timeline. February 16th, the trailer's arrival. April, my first formal complaint. June, Wade's response about Roy's rough patch. September, the pizza driver rerouting around the block. January 22nd, Eli's asthma attack in the ambulance's 4-minute and 12-second delay. And finally, February 9th, the overheard phone call and the 4 hours I'd since spent in a law library learning exactly what a prescriptive easement claim required. A woman near the middle of the room, whom I recognized as a homeowner from number 22 I'd only ever exchanged waves with, asked quietly, "Simone, is the ambulance thing actually connected to all this, or is that separate?" I answered her directly. "It's connected. My son's asthma attack didn't cause the delay because paramedics are slow. It happened because the direct route to my door was physically blocked by a vehicle that had been sitting there for 11 months by that point, on a property right-of-way that guarantees unobstructed access. I'm not telling you that to be dramatic. I'm telling you because I think it's the clearest possible illustration of what reasonable timeframe actually cost, in a way that a parking inconvenience alone might not have made obvious. The room had gone very quiet by the time I reached that last part. I watched Roy's face shift, the easy, confident set of it giving way to something tighter, more careful. That conversation was taken out of context, he said, his voice climbing in a way I had genuinely never heard from him in 6 years. You don't understand the legal side of any of this, Simone Yor. I understand it well enough that I spent a week with an attorney confirming exactly what you were doing, I said, and I did not raise my voice to meet his. I have a recorded 1996 easement guaranteeing unobstructed access to my garage. I have a year of written complaints to this board, each one met with an explanation that turned out not to be true. And I have a cease and desist letter already delivered to your attorney as of Tuesday, formally contesting any claim to prescriptive rights over that easement, effective the date I filed it, which means the clock you were counting on has already reset, and it reset before you ever backed that trailer out of the way. I looked around the room, not just at Roy. I'm not here tonight to ask anyone to hate their neighbor. I'm here because for a year I was told a documented legal right was actually a favor I should be grateful for patiently, while a specific, calculated deadline ran quietly in the background the entire time. I think everyone in this room deserves to know that's what reasonable actually looked like on this street for the last year. Roy tried once more, quieter this time, almost pleading. I never wanted it to actually cost you anything real, Simone. I told myself the whole time that you were still getting in and out fine, that it wasn't really hurting anyone. I let that sit for a moment before answering evenly. My son's ambulance took 4 minutes longer to reach him because of that trailer, Roy. I don't think either of us gets to decide any more what counts as not really hurting anyone. I watched something in his face go still at that, the specific stillness of a person hearing a consequence named plainly for the first time, rather than filtered through a year of his own careful self-justification. I found the line I'd rehearsed hardest, the one I wanted to land exactly right, and delivered it last, looking not at Roy but at the room as a whole. A shared driveway isn't a favor one neighbor grants another out of the goodness of their heart. It's a legal right, recorded on paper before either of us ever moved here. And no amount of casseroles or warm apologies gets to quietly turn a right into a favor just because one person is patient enough not to make a scene about it for a year. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of room, and it wasn't that kind of moment. But I watched 3 of the new board candidates near the back exchange a look I recognized immediately, and I watched Wade Higgins, for the first time in 6 years, decline to say anything reassuring on Roy's behalf at all. I found Wade briefly on my way out that night, mostly out of a professional habit I couldn't quite shake, the instinct to check in with everyone in a room before leaving a difficult situation behind. He looked older than I remembered him looking, standing there under the community room's harsh lights. I think I let reasonable mean whatever was easiest for me to say out loud for longer than I should have, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It wasn't an apology exactly, or not a complete one. But it was the first time in 6 years he'd said anything to me that didn't sound rehearsed on Roy's behalf, and I found, standing there, that I appreciated even that small, imperfect honesty more than I expected to. I want to give Roy one moment of real honesty here, because I don't think it's fair to leave him out of this story as a flat villain, even after everything. Later that evening, after most of the room had cleared out, he found me by my car and said quietly, without the practiced ease he usually carried, I told myself for a while it wasn't really hurting anything. I don't think I let myself think too hard about the ambulance part until you said it out loud just now. I don't excuse what he did, but I believe, standing there, that some part of him meant that, and some part of me, even that night, was willing to let it be true. I remember standing in that parking lot a moment longer, both of us quiet, before he added, almost as an afterthought, the attorney thing, the prescriptive rights, I want you to know that wasn't Diane's idea. She didn't even really know the details until recently. That part was mine. I appreciated him saying that, unprompted, clarifying something I hadn't actually asked him to clarify. It didn't change the year that had already happened, but it told me something about the specific shape of his own conscience, arriving a year too late to change anything, but arriving nonetheless. Nothing about what followed resolved cleanly, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one do people a disservice when they tie everything into too neat a bow. I want to describe the days immediately following that meeting because they were quieter than I expected. I drove home that night, checked on Eli sleeping soundly in his room, and stood for a long moment in my own driveway looking at the trailer still sitting there, unchanged, exactly where it had sat for 398 days. Nothing about the physical scene had shifted yet. What had changed was quieter than that, harder to photograph. The simple, irreversible fact that I had finally said the whole truth out loud, in the one room where it could no longer be quietly managed back into silence through a phone call from Wade. I remember feeling that first night less triumphant than simply thoroughly tired, the particular exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down takes its own kind of adjustment. The new board, elected 2 weeks later by a wide margin, moved quickly. Within a month, Roy received a formal notice requiring the trailer's removal within 14 days with a daily fine of $75 for noncompliance beyond that window. He moved it on day 12 to a storage lot he began renting across town, at what I later learned from Diane cost him $210 a month, a bill he'd have avoided entirely, of course, if he'd simply never blocked the easement in the first place. I remember the actual morning the trailer finally left, standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching Roy hitch it to his truck and pull it slowly off the easement for the first time in 398 days. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I might have expected from watching that specific moment for so long. I felt mostly a kind of quiet, physical relief, the same feeling I imagine as finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd half forgotten what your arms felt like without it. I watched the empty stretch of pavement where the trailer had sat, faintly discolored now from over a year of sitting in one place, and thought about how strange it was that reclaiming something that had always technically been mine could feel so much like receiving a gift. The board also passed, that same month, a formal bylaw amendment requiring any vehicle or equipment stored on a shared easement to be removed within 72 hours of a documented objection from an affected homeowner, closing the exact loophole Roy had spent a year quietly living inside. I attended the board's follow-up meeting that April, mostly out of curiosity about how the new bylaw language had been drafted, and found myself, unexpectedly, thanked publicly by the new president, a woman named Ophelia Grant who'd moved into the neighborhood only 2 years earlier and had run, in part, on exactly the platform Willa had described. I want to be honest that most of us on this new board only really understood how bad the old enforcement culture here was once Simone laid it out clearly, she said, to a smaller but still respectable crowd than the annual meeting had drawn. I think a lot of us assumed reasonable discretion meant something close to fair. It turns out it just meant whoever was friendliest with the person making the call. I hadn't expected to be thanked publicly for any of it, and I remember feeling something unclench slightly in my chest, hearing the new board name the old pattern out loud, unprompted, in a room that no longer needed me to be the one saying it. Ophelia asked me, after the meeting, whether I'd be willing to review the new bylaw language before it was finalized, given my first-hand experience with exactly the gap it was meant to close. I agreed, and spent an evening that week going through the draft line by line with Tabitha's input, tightening a few phrases that still carried some of the same vague, discretion-heavy language Wade had once relied on. It felt strange, honestly, to be handed a role in shaping the very rules that should have protected me a year earlier. I remember thinking, reading through that draft at my kitchen table, that this was probably the closest thing to real restitution I was going to get, not money, not a formal apology from Roy, but the practical certainty that the next person on Fenwick Grove Lane who found their driveway blocked wouldn't have to spend a year building their own case from scratch the way I had. I want to note, too, that the new bylaw wasn't a perfect solution, and I don't want to pretend it was. Ophelia herself acknowledged in that same meeting that enforcement would still depend on someone actually noticing and reporting a violation quickly, which meant the burden of vigilance hadn't disappeared entirely. It had simply moved from a year-long ordeal to a 72-hour window, which felt to me like the difference between an impossible standard and merely a demanding one. I've made my peace with that being the realistic best outcome available, even if some part of me still wishes the rule itself had simply never needed writing at all. Roy and I are not what we once were, and I want to say that plainly because I don't think this story should pretend otherwise. We still exchange the bare civility of people who live 100 feet apart, a nod at the mailbox, a wave when our cars pass. But the easy casserole-on-the-porch warmth of those first years never fully returned, and I've made a kind of peace with not expecting it to. Diane, though, surprised me. She stopped by that April alone and said, standing on my porch in a way that reminded me briefly of that very first casserole visit 6 years earlier, I told him more than once it had gone too far. I don't think I said it loud enough or often enough for it to actually matter. I'm sorry for that. I believed her, I still do. I asked her, standing there on the porch, whether she'd known about the attorney, about the specific legal strategy Roy had been pursuing rather than simply the ordinary stubbornness I'd assumed for most of that year. She was quiet for a moment before answering. Not the details, she said. I knew he'd talked to someone about property lines a while back. I don't think I let myself ask enough questions about what that conversation had actually been about. It was easier not to. I didn't press her further. I understood, standing there, that Diane had likely spent that entire year managing her own version of the same quiet, accumulating unease I'd spent it managing myself, just aimed in a different direction. She stayed on the porch a while longer that afternoon, and near the end, she said something I've thought about often since. I think Roy always believed that being a good neighbor mostly just meant being pleasant. I don't think he ever really understood that pleasant and fair aren't automatically the same thing. I told her I thought that was probably the truest thing anyone had said about him in 6 years, including things he'd said about himself. She laughed, a little sadly, and agreed. The part that means the most to me, honestly, out of everything, isn't anything that happened to Roy at all. It's Eli. 2 months after the trailer finally moved, a new family bought the house at number 10 after Willa passed peacefully that spring. And their daughter, close to Eli's age, was out front within days. And I watched Eli walk right up the now fully clear, fully accessible easement to introduce himself, without a single moment's hesitation, without the small, learned wariness I hadn't even fully realized he'd started carrying around our own driveway over that long year. I stood at the window and watched him laugh at something the new girl said, and I thought, whatever else that year cost us, he got that back, uncomplicated and immediate, the way it always should have been. I asked Eli a few weeks later, almost on impulse, whether he remembered much about the year the trailer had been there. He thought about it for a moment, 10 years old and already, I noticed, developing his own careful way of choosing words. I remember you took a lot of pictures of it, he said. I asked you once why, and you said it was in case anyone ever needed proof that something happened exactly the way it happened. I told him that was right. He nodded, satisfied, the way children are satisfied by explanations that map cleanly onto the version of events they'd already half worked out themselves, and went back to showing the new girl next door how far he could ride his bike without touching the handlebars. He asked me one more question that same afternoon, standing in the driveway watching the new neighbor's moving truck pull away. Are you still going to take pictures of stuff? I told him probably sometimes when it mattered. He considered that for a moment and said, with the plain, uncomplicated logic children sometimes manage better than adults, that seems like a good rule even when nothing bad is happening. I told him I thought so too, and I've kept that particular piece of his wisdom close ever since, turning it over some evenings the way I once turned over his grandfather's building inspector aphorisms. Small, sturdy, and truer than either of us fully understood in the moment we first said them out loud. I think, of everything that changed on Fenwick Grove Lane that year, that's the piece of it I'd fight to protect all over again, not the driveway itself, but the version of the lesson my son actually walked away with. I keep coming back to something Tabitha said to me in her office before any of this had fully resolved. A year of shifting excuses, none of which were ever true, combined with a documented, calculated deadline. That's not a coincidence. That's a plan, and now it's a documented one. That's not quite the line I'd want you to carry out of this with you, though. The one I'd actually want you to remember is the one I said in that clubhouse, under fluorescent lights, to a room that had spent 6 years calling patience a virtue without ever once asking what it was actually costing me. A shared right isn't a favor one neighbor grants another out of the goodness of their heart. It's a right, recorded on paper before any of the warmth or the casseroles or the easy apologies ever entered the picture. And no amount of lickability gets to quietly turn a right into a favor just because someone is patient enough not to make a scene about it for 398 days. I think about that difference often now, the difference between the kind of patience that's actually a virtue and the kind that's simply an unpaid debt someone else has learned to count on collecting indefinitely. For most of 6 years, I honestly couldn't have told you which one I was practicing. It's only from the other side of that clubhouse meeting that I can see clearly it had stopped being the first kind years before I finally let myself act on it. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, beyond the specifics of my own driveway, it's that the difference between those two kinds of patience isn't always visible from the inside. Sometimes you only find out which one you were practicing once you finally count the days out loud, in a room where the number can no longer be quietly explained away. I want to add one more thought here because I think it matters as much as anything else I've said tonight. None of this required me to become a different kind of person than I'd always been. I didn't have to become loud or combative or suspicious of every small kindness a neighbor offers. I simply had to stop letting my own patience be mistaken by anyone, including myself, for permission. Those are two very different things, and learning to tell them apart, even now, remains the single most useful thing that entire year taught me. If this one landed for you, I'd love to hear your version of it down in the comments. The right you let get quietly redefined as a favor, the folder of photographs you kept just in case, the year you finally stopped waiting for someone else to notice. Share this with someone who's still parking down the street rather than making a scene, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe because there are a lot more stories like this one still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one. And if tonight's story is still unfolding in your own life right now, I hope it helps to hear this. The folder doesn't have to be dramatic to matter. It can just be a phone full of dated photographs, a copy of a deed pulled from a records office on an ordinary afternoon, a habit you started because a friend once suggested it almost in passing. You may not need it for years, you may never need it at all, but if the day ever comes when you do, I promise you'll be glad you already started counting.